the first cut is an act of faith, not into canvas, but into time itself. Elara Vance held the scalpel, a surgeon's tool for a patient 4 centuries old, and its polished steel gleamed under the cold, white glare of the articulated lamp. The patient was a portrait by a minor Dutch master, its surface clouded by a darkened, yellowed varnish that clung to the oil paint like a shroud of amber. To an untrained eye, it was an antique haze, a charming patina. To Elara, it was a cataract, blinding the work from its own truth. She pressed the tip of the blade, angled just so, against a microscopic edge of the varnish. The pressure was infinitesimal, a whisper of force guided by a decade of study and an innate cellular stillness. A tiny flake, no bigger than a grain of salt, lifted away. Beneath it, a sliver of cerulean blue bloomed, as vibrant and electric as the moment the artist's brush had left the canvas in 1634. The air in her lab, thick with the astringent piney scent of solvents and the dry, papery smell of aging linen, seemed to hold its breath with her. This was her sanctuary, a hermetically sealed chamber of science and ghosts, where her obsession was not just a profession, but a creed, to peel back the lies of time and let the dead speak. The chime of the lab's security door was an intrusion, a sound from another world. Elara didn't look up, her focus absolute, but she knew the specific weight of the footsteps on the polished concrete floor. Only one person entered her lab without knocking. Still communing with the spirits, Elara? Julian Croft's voice was like aged whiskey, smooth, warm, with a smoky undertone of effortless authority. He stood behind her, his reflection a soft-focused titan in the dark glass of a dormant analysis screen. At 65, he was more institution than man, a living monument to the world of art whose pronouncements could mint or bankrupt a reputation overnight. "They're chatty today," Elara murmured, not breaking her gaze from the painting. She made another incision, lifting another flake. "This one complains of bad lighting for the last 100 years, and a brief, undignified period in a tobacconist's shop in Ghent." Julian laughed, a rich, genuine sound that had charmed museum boards and billionaire donors for 30 years. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a familiar, paternal weight. "That's why you're the best. You don't just restore paintings, you hear their confessions." He squeezed gently. "I need you. Clear your schedule." Elara finally set down her scalpel and turned on her stool, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the human scale of the room. Julian's face was alight with a zeal she hadn't seen in years. It was the look he'd had when he'd first secured the museum's endowment, the look that had convinced the Italian government to loan them a Botticelli. It was the look of a hunter who has spotted a unicorn. "What is it?" "A ghost," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "A whisper, a myth, really. A lost Pissarro. Not just lost, undocumented, from his Pontoise period. A study for the red roofs, but from an entirely different angle. If it's real, Elara, it's not just a painting. It's a new chapter in the history of Impressionism, a career-capping triumph for the Northwood." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "For us." The word hung in the sterile air between them. United States. For 15 years, since he discovered her as a brilliant graduate student whose doctoral thesis on pigment degradation was causing a stir, he had been the architect of her career. He was her mentor, her champion, her staunchest defender. The closest thing she'd ever had to a father, after her own had faded. The intellectual worship she felt for him was a foundational pillar of her life. He was not just Julian Croft. He was the idea of knowledge itself, made manifest. How could she not trust him? Still, a small clinical part of her brain registered the subtle tremor in his hand, the way his charisma seemed to be working a little too hard. The crate arrived 2 days later. It wasn't the standard, climate-controlled museum transport she was used to, but a battered-looking wooden box with German customs stamps. A minor curiosity. Inside, nestled in a bed of aging foam, was the painting. It was small, no more than 24 inches across, an oil on linen. Elara's first impression was a jolt of pure academic wonder. The brushwork was astonishingly confident. The fractured light and broken color, so characteristic of Camille Pissarro's revolutionary period. It felt right. The soul of it felt right. Begin the full workup immediately, Julian had instructed, hovering at the lab door. Microstratigraphy, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, the works. The board is breathing down my neck. They're antsy about the acquisition cost, and the press is already sniffing around. For a week, Elara lived inside the painting. She took microscopic core samples, charted the layers of pigment like a geologist mapping the Earth's crust. Ground layer, lead white, chalk, and oil. Typical. Pigment analysis, viridian, cobalt blue, Naples yellow, all available to Pissarro in the 1870s. The canvas weave was consistent, the age of the stretcher bars plausible. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect. It was on the 8th day, hunched over the spectral data from the GCMS, that she found it. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a whisper, a molecular ghost. In the lead white ground layer, beneath the riot of impressionist color, was a trace element, a single anomalous spike on the graph, barium sulfate. Not the naturally occurring barite that a 19th century color grinder might have used as an extender, but a synthetic, precipitated form, a modern form. It was a vanishingly small amount, easily dismissed as a statistical artifact, a stray signal, a contamination, but it was there. Her instruments were calibrated to the nanogram. They did not lie. She brought the printout to Julian's office, a space of mahogany and leather that smelled of old books and power. He was on the phone, laughing with some unseen caller, waving her in. When he hung up, he beamed at her. "Good news, I hope? Are we ready to call the New York Times?" Elara laid the graph on his expansive desk. "I found something. It's anomalous." She pointed with a pen to the spike. "Synthetic barium sulfate. In the ground layer. It's inconsistent with an 1877 provenance." Julian picked up the paper, barely glancing at it. He held it as if it were a restaurant menu he had no intention of ordering from. He smiled, a patient, forgiving smile. "Elara, you've been in the lab for a week straight. Contamination is a fact of life. A technician in the 1950s cleans the painting with a modern solvent that contains a barium suspension. A restorer in the 80s touches up the lining with an adhesive that has a synthetic filler. There are a dozen plausible explanations. The anomaly is under the original paint layers, Julian. A later contamination wouldn't penetrate the gesso. I'm sure of it." He set the paper down and leaned back, steepling his fingers. The charming mentor was gone, replaced by the cool, unshakable director. "Are you? Are you 100% sure? Sure enough to kill the most important discovery this museum has ever made? Sure enough to publicly declare that my eye, my 30 years of experience, is wrong?" He let the question hang in the air. This wasn't a discussion, it was a test of loyalty. Sometimes, a fact is just a stray number, not a narrative. Don't let your admirable caution cloud your nerve, my dear. We are on the 1-yard line. This is no time to fumble. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the city, his back to her. The dismissal was absolute. Elara stood frozen, the graph on his desk suddenly looking flimsy, hysterical. He was Julian Croft. He saw the soul of the work. She saw the molecules. Who was she to argue? She had been trained to trust the data, but she had been conditioned to trust him more. The conflict was a physical sensation, a knot of ice in her stomach. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps she was just a technician, too lost in the weeds to see the magnificent forest. "The unveiling is Friday," he said, his voice once again warm, inviting her back into the fold. "You'll be by my side, of course. This is your triumph, too." She left his office, leaving the printout on his desk, a surrendered weapon. Back in the sterile quiet of her lab, the Pissarro sat on its easel, glowing under the lights. It looked magnificent. A masterpiece. A lie. And she, Dr. Elara Vance, was about to become its first and most important authenticator. The air in the auditorium was electric, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of 100 whispered conversations. A sea of black-clad figures, critics, curators, collectors, and journalists, sat in rapt attention. On the stage, under the hot, buttery lights, the Pissarro stood on a velvet-draped easel, looking less like a painting and more like a captured piece of the sun. Beside it, Julian Croft commanded the podium, a maestro in his element. Elara sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The silk of her dress felt slick against her skin. Every time the camera flashes strobed across the room, they left searing imprints of the painting on her retinas. Art history is not a static text, Julian began, his voice resonating with practiced gravitas. It is a living, breathing thing. It grows. It reveals itself in seismic moments of discovery. Today is one of those moments. He was magnificent. He wove a narrative of chance and destiny, of a lost treasure resurfacing through a combination of luck and the museum's discerning eye. Then he turned his gaze, full of warmth and pride, directly on Elara. But intuition is not enough. In the modern age, greatness must withstand the rigors of science. For that, I turned to the Northwood's own doctor, Elara Vance. He gestured for her to stand. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room. Elara rose stiffly, a pained smile plastered on her face. The knot of ice in her stomach had grown into a jagged stone. "Doctor, Vance's analysis," Julian continued, his voice booming with confidence, "utilizing the most advanced spectroscopic and chromatographic techniques, has confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, what our hearts told us was true. Every pigment, every layer of ground, every fiber of the canvas speaks to a single, unequivocal truth. We are in the presence of a lost work by the master, Camille Pissarro. He was lying, or rather, he was telling a greater, more seductive truth that simply ignored a smaller, inconvenient one. He was using her reputation, her science, as the final, unimpeachable seal on his narrative." As she sat back down, the applause washing over her, Elara felt a profound sense of dislocation. She had become an unwilling accomplice, her meticulous science co-opted into a grand performance. The pride she was supposed to feel was curdled by the bitter taste of her own suppressed certainty. For 6 weeks, the art world was incandescent with the news. The Croft Pissarro, as the tabloids dubbed it, was a sensation. Museum attendance shattered records. Julian was on the cover of Art Forum, his face the very picture of intellectual triumph. Elara tried to forget the barium sulfate spike. She tried to convince herself that Julian, with his decades of experience, had seen a larger picture she was blind to. She repeated his words to herself. "Don't let your admirable caution cloud your nerve." She buried herself in other projects, but a new and unwelcome cynicism had taken root. She'd look at the flawless varnish on a Rembrandt and wonder what stories it was hiding, what convenient truths it protected. The end came not with a whisper, but a digital thunderclap. It was a Tuesday morning. Elara was calibrating a polarizing light microscope when her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague at the Getty. It was a single line, "I'm so sorry, Elara," followed by a link. She clicked it. The headline, from a prestigious online art journal known for its forensic investigations, was brutal. "Northwood's Pissarro, a spectacular fraud. Rival lab finds phthalocyanine green." Her blood ran cold. Phthalocyanine green. A synthetic pigment. A brilliant, stable, beautiful green that Pissarro could never have used for one simple reason. It hadn't been invented until 1938, more than 30 years after his death. It was a chemical signature as loud and definitive as a gunshot. The article was merciless. It detailed the Getty's independent analysis, an analysis they had undertaken after an anonymous tip. It even mentioned the faint anomaly of barium sulfate, dismissing it as a potential lead that the Northwood's own lab had inexplicably failed to pursue. The world dissolved into a sickening roar in her ears. She read the line again. Failed to pursue. Julian convened an emergency press conference for that afternoon. Elara was summoned not to his office, but to a small, sterile waiting room near the auditorium, the same one where she had waited before the triumphant unveiling. This time, she was alone. She thought he would want to see her, to strategize, to manage the crisis together. The minutes ticked by. A junior PR staffer finally opened the door. "They're ready," he said, avoiding her eyes. He didn't lead her to the stage, but to a reserved seat in the back of the auditorium, in the shadows. Julian walked to the podium. He looked stricken, his face etched with lines of profound gravity and sorrow. He gripped the sides of the lectern, his knuckles white. He looked for all the world like a betrayed man. "There is no easy way to say this," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "The Northwood Museum of Art has been the victim of a deception, a complex and deeply cynical forgery." He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle over the stunned reporters. "The moment the Getty's findings were brought to my attention, I initiated a full internal review of our own analytical data. And it is with the deepest, most profound disappointment that I must report where the failure occurred." Elara leaned forward, her heart pounding. What was he doing? "Our protocols are sound," Julian said, his voice hardening. "Our equipment is state-of-the-art, but science is only as reliable as the analyst who interprets it." He held up a document. From her distance, Elara recognized it, the spectral graph she had printed. Our own analysis did, in fact, contain evidence of chemical anomalies, evidence that was tragically misinterpreted, overlooked, chalked up to contamination by an analyst whose inexperience, it appears, led to a catastrophic lapse in judgment. He didn't have to say her name. Every eye in the room already knew. "To be clear," Julian said, his voice now cold as steel, "Dr. Elara Vance's preliminary findings, which I have here, show none of the definitive red flags that a more seasoned conservator would have identified as the cause for immediate alarm." He held up another sheaf of papers, falsified lab notes. He had taken her work, her name, her reputation, and was systematically gutting it in front of the world. He was presenting her suppressed doubt as incompetence and his own willful blindness as a leader's trust in a subordinate who had failed him. He was not just saving himself, he was erasing her. The press conference ended. The questions from reporters were a frantic, overlapping din. Elara didn't hear them. She felt nothing but a vast, silent, crystalline shock. The person she had revered, the man whose intellect she had placed above her own scientific reason, had taken her devotion and used it as the foundation for his escape hatch. He had not only sacrificed her, he had made her the author of her own destruction. She walked out of the auditorium, her face a blank mask. No one met her gaze. Her colleagues, people she had mentored and lunched with for years, suddenly found the floor intensely interesting. By the time she reached her lab, the official email had already arrived. Her employment with the Northwood Museum was terminated, effective immediately. Her access codes would be deactivated within the hour. 6 months passed. Time, which Elara had once measured in centuries and the slow decay of pigments, now moved in a thick gray sludge. Her new life was a world of right angles and clean cuts. She worked in a high-end framing shop in a gentrified part of the city, a place that smelled of raw basswood, rabbit skin glue, and the faint, acidic tang of archival matboard. The irony was a constant low-grade fever. She, who had once held the secrets of masterpieces in her hands, now spent her days ensuring that prints of them were perfectly centered. Her obsessive focus, once a celebrated gift, was now merely a job requirement. Her cuts were perfect to the millimeter. Her corners were flawless. Her customers, wealthy people with blank walls, would praise her artisan's touch. They had no idea they were talking to a ghost. The passion she'd once felt for art, that deep, almost spiritual connection to the object, was gone. It had been surgically removed, and the wound had scarred over into a patch of numb, dead tissue. She didn't feel anger anymore, not in any hot, kinetic way. She felt a profound, tectonic stillness, the calm of a landscape that has been irrevocably altered by a cataclysm. She lived in a small, characterless apartment that felt more like a holding cell than a home. It was here, one rainy November evening, that she saw him. She was eating takeout straight from the carton, watching the local news, when his face filled the screen. Julian Croft, looking relaxed and professorial in a tweed jacket, was being interviewed about his new, landmark exhibition at the Northwood, The Nature of Genius. Genius, Julian said, leaning forward with that familiar, intimate charm, is not just about talent, it's about authority. It's the power to convince the world of a new way of seeing. Think of Caravaggio, of Turner. Their contemporaries called them vulgar, unfinished. But their genius, their truth, ultimately rewrote the rules of what art could be. The interviewer smiled, captivated. And what about fakes, Julian? The art world seems so full of them. How can the average person ever know what's real? Julian's expression shifted to one of gentle wisdom, the patient teacher. An excellent question. A forgery is merely a lie told in paint. It has skill, perhaps, but no soul, no authentic vision. It crumbles under scrutiny. We saw that with the unfortunate Pissarro incident earlier this year. A tragedy, yes, a profound betrayal by a trusted colleague, but also a validation of the system. In the end, the truth always comes out. True genius, like true science, is self-correcting. The carton slipped from Elara's fingers, splattering cold noodles across the floor. It wasn't the lie that struck her. It was the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of him twisting her ruin into a philosophical talking point. A betrayal by a trusted colleague. He had taken her name, her life's work, and turned it into a tidy anecdote for his new sermon. He showed no remorse, no flicker of doubt, only the serene, unshakable confidence of a man who had never once paid a price. The stillness within her finally fractured, but it didn't explode into rage. It condensed. It hardened into something cold, clear, and diamond sharp. She didn't clean up the noodles. She stood up, grabbed her keys, and walked out into the rain-slicked night. The storage facility was a concrete monolith on the industrial edge of the city, smelling of wet asphalt and despair. Her unit, C-38, was a 10 by 10 foot cube of cold air and silence. For 6 months, she had paid the bill but could not bring herself to visit. It was a tomb, and she had been afraid to look at the body. She rolled up the corrugated metal door. The screech echoed in the cavernous hallway. There it was, her life's work, her real life, packed into archival boxes and draped in plastic sheeting. She saw the familiar shapes of her polarizing microscope case, the spectrometer, the custom-built gas chromatograph. These were not just tools. They were extensions of her mind, the instruments that translated the physical world into empirical truth, the truth he had taught her to ignore. Methodically, she began to unpack. She unswaddled the mass spectrometer from its plastic shroud, its stainless steel surfaces cool and indifferent to her touch. She plugged a heavy-duty extension cord into the hallway outlet and connected a power strip. One by one, she switched on the machines. The low, familiar hums filled the silence of the concrete box, the blinking green and amber lights a sudden constellation in the gloom. This was no longer a tomb. It was a laboratory, an armory. Her plan did not arrive in a flash of inspiration. It surfaced like a deep-water creature, slowly rising from the crushing darkness of the past 6 months. The Pissarro was a lost cause. Julian had successfully cauterized that wound, amputating her to save the limb. Exposing that single fraud now would be pointless, a case of her word against his, the bitter, blacklisted analyst versus the celebrated museum director. No, she couldn't attack the branch. She had to go for the root. A name surfaced in her memory, a name she hadn't thought of in years. Niccolò Sarto. The obscure, brilliant Renaissance painter Julian had discovered 30 years ago, the discovery that had launched his career from promising academic to art world royalty. It was the foundation of his entire empire of taste, his unimpeachable authority. Elara stood in the cold, sterile light of the storage unit, the glow of the instrument panels illuminating her face. Her expression was unreadable. She didn't weep. She didn't smile. She pulled the keyboard for the spectrometer towards her, the plastic cool under her fingertips. She began calibrating the machine, her movements precise and certain. She was recalibrating herself, honing her grief into a weapon of exquisite sharpness. The hunt was no longer about proving a single painting was a lie. It was about proving that Julian Croft's entire life was one. The storage unit became her world. By day, she was the quiet, precise framer. By night, she descended into the concrete catacomb, the low hum of the machines her only companion. She had surrounded herself with every book, every monograph, every auction catalog that mentioned the name Niccolò Sarto. On the large screen of her mass spectrometer, she projected the half-dozen authenticated Sarto paintings, all of which, she noted with a cold sense of clarity, had passed through Julian's hands early in his career. Her theory was no longer a theory, it was a conviction. Niccolò Sarto was Julian's magnum opus, not the discovery of him, but the creation of him. a phantom born in the ambitious mind of a young academic. Julian had found a handful of competent but unremarkable late Renaissance portraits by unknown artists, built a compelling but ultimately unverifiable narrative around them, and christened them as the work of a lost genius. He had studied the period so flawlessly that he could weave a story from whispers and gaps in the historical record. His genius wasn't in art history, it was in fiction. Elara knew she couldn't prove it, not directly. To do so would mean challenging the very foundations of connoisseurship, a battle she, a disgraced analyst, could never win. So, her plan would not be to attack the original Sartos. Her plan was to build a Trojan horse. She would forge a new Sarto, a painting so stylistically perfect, so chemically unimpeachable, that it would be irresistible to him. She knew Julian's ego. He could not and would not allow a major work by his artist to be authenticated by anyone else. He would have to be the one to pronounce it genuine, and when he did, he would be walking directly into her crosshairs. The painting would contain her poison pill. She resurrected the research from her postdoctoral fellowship, a project ironically funded by a grant from the Northwood to develop inert chemical markers for conservation purposes. She had created a unique synthetic binding polymer, an isotope marker she designated EC1138. It was a microscopic inert chain of molecules that could be mixed into paints or varnishes. It was invisible to the eye, undetectable by standard analysis, but would fluoresce brilliantly under a specific narrow wavelength of ultraviolet light. A wavelength only she, its inventor, knew. The patent, filed by the museum, was buried in years of paperwork. Julian had signed off on the grant application himself, glanced at the final report, and promptly forgotten it. He knew of its existence, but he didn't know its soul. He wouldn't look for it. He would be authenticating a painting containing a chemical signature whose patent bore his own institution's name. It was perfect. She liquidated her retirement account and the small portfolio her parents had left her. The transactions were a series of cold, impersonal clicks, funneling the money through anonymous crypto wallets. Her life savings, once destined for a down payment on a house, were now being used to buy lies. Her first purchase was a piece of the past, a 16th century poplar panel sourced from an architectural salvage yard in Umbria that dealt in materials from deconsecrated churches. It arrived in a crate, smelling of incense, damp stone, and decay. Elara planed it herself, her movements sure and steady, the scent of ancient wood filling her small workspace. Next came the pigments. This was her home turf. She became a ghost on the dark web, a connoisseur of chemical obscurities. She found a dealer in Kabul who could provide lapis lazuli from the original Badakhshan mines, the same source Renaissance masters had used for their celestial ultramarine. She bought toxic lead tin yellow from a specialty supplier in Germany, cinnabar for the vermilion, and raw azurite she would grind herself. She cooked her own binder, a mixture of linseed oil and walnut oil, heating it in a beaker over a lab-grade hot plate, the fumes acrid and dangerous. Her lab, once a sterile sanctuary for preserving truth, was now a toxic alchemical workshop for creating a lie. Night after night, she worked. First, the ground layer, a painstaking application of gesso made from gypsum and animal skin glue, just as Cennino Cennini had described in his 15th century treatise. She worked it into the ancient poplar, feeling the history of the wood, its cracks and imperfections. Then came the underdrawing, a faint sketch in charcoal. She wasn't just copying Sarto's style, she was inhabiting it. She had studied his, Julian's, Sartos until the brushstrokes were imprinted on her soul. The slightly elongated fingers, the melancholic turn of a head, the specific way the light caught the fold of a velvet sleeve. She mixed her pigments on a slab of porphyry, grinding the brilliant blue lapis with a molar, the circular motion hypnotic. Into the cobalt blue she was preparing for the subject's robe. She added a single, invisible drop of EC1138, the poison pill, a tiny ticking bomb of truth hidden in plain sight. The act of painting was a strange and hollow experience. There was no joy, no artistic release. It was a cold, calculated execution of a formula. Every brushstroke was a chess move. She was not a creator. She was a weapon being fashioned by its own hand. She looked at her fingers, stained with lead white and verdigris, and realized she had become a forger, the very monster she had dedicated her life to hunting. The thought brought no horror, only a sense of grim, circular logic. Julian had made her this way. He had taught her that the narrative was more powerful than the truth. She was simply building a better narrative. After a month of obsessive, sleepless work, it was almost finished. A small portrait of an unknown Florentine woman, her gaze distant, her lips set in a faint, knowing smile. The light in the painting seemed to emanate from within the panel itself, the colors possessing a gem-like luminosity. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And it was the most cynical thing Elara had ever done. She stared at it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the storage unit, the face in the portrait seeming to judge her. She had poured all her knowledge, her skill, her soul into this gilded lie. Now, all she had to do was release it into the world and wait for the monster to come. The final step was to give the painting its age. Genius wasn't enough. It needed the authority of time. In a corner of the storage unit, Elara constructed a small environmental chamber using high-density foam insulation and a lab-grade humidifier and heater. For a week, she subjected the finished portrait to a punishing cycle of temperature and humidity shifts, coaxing the paint and gesso to expand and contract at different rates. Under a microscope, she watched as a delicate, convincing web of crake lure spread across the surface, a perfect imitation of 400 years of quiet existence. She then applied a thin coat of varnish, one she had concocted with damar resin and tinted with a hint of asphaltum, giving it the golden, smoky patina of centuries. The final touch was a forger's flourish. Using a fine brush, she worked a mixture of dust and lamp black into the newly formed cracks. Now, the lie was complete. A perfect forgery, however, is worthless without a story. Elara spent a week fabricating the painting's provenance. She acquired a 19th century leather-bound journal from a flea market, its pages brittle and foxed. Using a quill and iron gall ink she mixed herself, she carefully added a new entry, mimicking the faded copperplate script. June 12th, 1888. Acquired today in Florence, a most melancholic portrait of a lady. The dealer, a man of questionable repute but occasional good taste, claims it to be the work of the elusive Sarto. A fancy, I am sure, but her eyes, they haunt. On the back of the poplar panel, she used a heated dye to press a fake collector's stamp. A minor German baronet she knew had a collection liquidated in the 1920s. The details were obscure enough to be plausible, a breadcrumb trail leading down a cold, dead-end path. Now, she needed to get it on the market. For this, she had to call in a debt. Her target was a man named Klaus Richter, a mild-mannered archivist at a university museum in Philadelphia. 5 years ago, Klaus had made a disastrous attribution error that would have ended his career. Elara, then at the Northwood, had quietly discovered his mistake during a joint research project and, seeing his genuine panic and remorse, had helped him correct it before anyone senior noticed. She never mentioned it again. Klaus owed her his professional life. Her call sent him into a quiet panic. "Elara, is everything all right? I heard what happened at the Northwood. It's a disgrace." "I'm fine, Klaus," she said, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. "I need a favor. It's unorthodox." She explained the situation with calculated vagueness. A private collector she was advising wished to sell a recently rediscovered painting. For reasons of privacy, it needed to be done discreetly through a minor European house. Klaus had a cousin who worked as a cataloger at a small, respectable auction house in Hamburg. All Klaus had to do was make the introduction for her client via email and forward the dossier she would provide. He would be a blind cutout, nothing more. "A Sardo?" Klaus whispered, the name instantly recognizable to him. "My God, Elara. Whose collection?" "It's better if you don't know," she said. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with fear and dawning comprehension. He knew he was being asked to step into a gray, dangerous space. He also knew he could not refuse. The email was sent the next day. The painting, packed in a custom crate with the fabricated provenance, was shipped to the Hamburg auction house from a third-party service. Her hands were clean. The painting was now in the wild, but it was a tree falling in a silent forest. She needed to make sure Julian heard it. Her chosen instrument was a blog called The Gilded Brush, written by a young, acid-penned critic named Ben Carter. Carter was everything Julian despised: loud, ambitious, digitally native, and profoundly unimpressed by the self-regarding authority of the old guard. His posts were a cocktail of genuine insight, sharp-elbowed gossip, and clickbait headlines. Julian had once referred to him in a faculty lounge as an arsonist with a thesaurus. From a new laptop, using a public Wi-Fi network and a temporary email address, Elara crafted her anonymous tip. It was short and pointed, designed to stroke Carter's ego and ignite his predatory instincts. Subject: a tip for the only critic who isn't afraid of Croft. Body: you might want to look at Lot 34 in the upcoming Kleinfelder's auction in Hamburg. They're calling it Circle of Ghirlandaio, but anyone with an eye can see it's a sardo, a major one. The Northwood must have missed it, or maybe Croft is losing his touch after the Pissarro mess. You should break the story before he tries to bury it. She attached a high-resolution image of the painting. She hit send and closed the laptop. The lure was in the water. 3 days later, the post went live. The headline was a masterpiece of provocation, even better than she could have hoped for. A new sardo? Or is Julian Croft about to have his next Pissarro moment? The article was pure Carter. It praised the luminous, haunting quality of the painting, juxtaposing a high-res image with a known sardo from the Northwoods collection. It detailed the obscure provenance, framing it as a romantic mystery. Then, it went for the kill. The art world still bears the scar of the Northwoods' Pissarro fiasco, a debacle rooted in what director Julian Croft called a failure of analysis. Now, a potential masterpiece by Croft's own signature artist surfaces in a minor German auction house, right under his nose. One has to ask, is the king of connoisseurship sleeping on his throne? Or will he swoop in to claim this prize and silence the critics who say his eye isn't what it used to be? The Gilded Brush will be watching. Elara read the article from her sterile apartment, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. It was a declaration of war, and she was the anonymous arms dealer. She watched the post get shared on social media, the comment section filling with a mix of excitement and schadenfreude. The trap was now public. Julian couldn't ignore it without looking weak and incompetent. He was being challenged on his own turf, over his own legacy. His pride would never allow it. The confirmation came that Friday, a short news brief in an art trade publication. Northwood director Julian Croft is said to be taking a keen interest in a potential Niccolò Sarto portrait that has recently surfaced in Germany. Sources say Croft is in communication with Kleinfelder's auction house to arrange a private viewing and analysis of the piece. Elara closed her laptop. A profound, cold calm settled over her. The horse was at the gates, and Julian Croft, the great intellectual, the arbiter of genius, was about to throw them open himself. The world outside Elara's self-imposed exile began to move. Ben Carter's blog buzzed with smug updates as he chronicled Julian's every move like a war correspondent. Croft dispatches his top curator to Hamburg. Sources say the Northwood is preparing a significant offer to pull the sardo from auction. Klaus Richter, her unwilling co-conspirator, forwarded her scans of internal museum communications, his brief, terrified messages like notes passed under a prison door. He's setting up a special acquisitions committee. He's not just buying it, Elara. He's building a fortress around it. Julian was performing his authority for the world to see. He was a general moving his troops, a grand show of due diligence designed to make his eventual triumph seem not just like a victory, but an inevitability. He was controlling the narrative, just as he always did. Watching it unfold, Elara felt a cold satisfaction, but also a new nagging question. Why Sarto? Julian could have invented any artist. Why a minor Florentine? What was so special about that specific time, that specific place in his own history? This question drove her from her workshop back to the world of research, but this time she wasn't studying pigment composition. She was studying Julian Croft. She spent days in the microfilm archive of the university library, scrolling through decades-old art journals, the mechanical whir of the reader, a lonely sound in the dusty silence. She was looking for Julian's juvenilia, his first published articles, the seeds of his Sarto theory. And that is where she found her father. It was in the index of a long-defunct academic journal from 1993, a listing for a paper presented at a symposium in Chicago. Vance, Dr. Alistair. Anomalous pigment signatures in the sardocorpus, a case for reattribution. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Dr. Alistair Vance, her father. He had been a brilliant, if unassuming, art historian at a state university, a man whose quiet passion had been her first entry into the world of art. He had abandoned his career abruptly when she was a child, citing burnout. He never spoke of it again, and a deep, impenetrable melancholy had settled over him for the rest of his life. She had always thought of it as a personal failing, a lack of fight. Her hands trembling, she searched frantically for the paper itself. It wasn't there. The journal had published the symposium's schedule, but not the full proceedings. It was a digital ghost. She kept digging, her search becoming more frantic. She found the symposium's program. Her father had been scheduled to speak on a panel. The moderator of that panel was a young rising star from Northwood, Julian Croft. A different search, this time through the university's own archives. News clippings from the local paper's campus section. The story emerged in a series of stark, black and white headlines. Professor accused of plagiarism. A graduate student had accused Alistair Vance of lifting entire passages for a minor monograph on Renaissance framemaking. An internal investigation was launched. University panel upholds plagiarism finding. Her father was denied tenure. He resigned in disgrace. The story was small, contained, a minor academic scandal that would have been invisible to the wider world. But its effect was absolute. It had been a professional execution. The dates. The plagiarism accusation had been made 1 month before the Chicago symposium. Her father withdrew his paper. He lost his job. His career was over. And Julian Croft, the moderator of the panel, where his own foundational discovery would have been dismantled, faced no challenge. A year later, Julian published his definitive career-making book, Niccolò Sarto, and the Soul of Florence. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. Her father had discovered the fraud. He was about to expose it. And Julian hadn't just let him fall. He had pushed him. The plagiarism charge, she was certain now, was a fabrication. A lie whispered in the right ear. A seed of doubt planted and cultivated until it became a career-ending weapon. Julian hadn't just built his career on a lie. He had built it on the tomb of her father's reputation. Elara leaned back from the microfilm reader, the harsh light illuminating the tears she hadn't realized were streaming down her face. Every memory of her father was instantly brutally recontextualized. His quiet shuffling around the house, his refusal to ever visit a museum with her, his vague, sad answers when she'd asked about his old work. It wasn't burnout. It was shame. It was defeat. It was the lifelong pain of a man who had been silenced, his truth stolen from him by the very man who had gone on to mentor his own daughter. Julian's paternal warmth towards her, his championing of her career, had it been a form of guilt, or was it something more perverse, a way of keeping his enemy's legacy close, a constant private monument to his own victory? The realization was a physical blow, a core of rage and grief so profound it almost choked her. This was no longer about her career, about her name. It was about a life, a family, a legacy of stolen truth. But with the grief came a terrifying clarity. The tactics she was now employing, the anonymous tip, the fabricated story, the manipulation of a vulnerable colleague, were his. She was using the enemy's weapons. The thought didn't stop her. It hardened her. It purified her rage into something absolute. This was not just justice anymore. It was an inheritance. That night, in her apartment, she opened an old photo album. She found the picture she was looking for. A 6-year-old Elara, beaming, holding up a finger painting. Beside her stood her father, young and smiling, but with a familiar sadness in his eyes she had never understood until now. It was the look of a man already haunted. She closed the album, her expression as still and cold as the forged portrait now sitting in a vault in Hamburg. The moral compromise no longer mattered. The victory she sought wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be righteous. It would simply be necessary. a debt 30 years overdue that she would now collect with interest. The news broke on a Monday. The Northwood Museum of Art, in a special announcement, confirmed it had acquired the Lost Sarto from the German auction house for an undisclosed but rumored to be record-setting sum. Julian Croft was quoted extensively in the New York Times piece. In a time of cynicism, it is a profound affirmation to see a work of such genius return to the light. We have a duty to preserve these masters for the public, and we have done our duty. Ben Carter's blog ran a victory lap, gloating that the Gilded Brush had single-handedly saved a masterpiece from obscurity. Elara read the articles on her phone while sitting on a city bus, a ghost among the morning commuters. She felt nothing, no elation, no thrill of victory. Only the quiet, steady hum of machinery clicking into its final sequence. A week later, the official invitation arrived in her email inbox, a relic from a life she no longer lived. The Northwood Museum of Art cordially invites you to a special presentation, The Authentication of a Masterpiece. Join director Julian Croft for a live-streamed lecture as he reveals the definitive scientific and connoisseurial evidence confirming the identity of our new acquisition, Portrait of a Florentine Lady, as a major work by Niccolò Sardo. The supreme arrogance of it was almost beautiful. He wasn't just going to announce his findings, he was going to perform them. He was going to use science, her science, as his final unassailable proof, silencing any lingering whispers from the Pissarro fiasco. He was building his own gallows and calling it a throne. Elara opened her laptop. Her work was nearly done. She began compiling the dossier, her movements precise and unhurried. It was a slim, elegant, and utterly lethal package of information. The first page was a concise abstract on the unique properties of the EMC 1138 binding polymer. The second was a high-resolution scan of the patent, granted to the Northwood Museum 2 years prior. The third was a copy of the final grant report, complete with a list of its potential applications in conservation and authentication, a report Julian himself had signed. The final page contained 2 items side by side, a spectral graph from her mass spectrometer, showing the unmistakable spike of EC1138 in the cobalt blue pigment of the Sarto, and a digitized copy of her father's 1993 symposium abstract. There were no accusations, no narrative, just data, just truth. She opened a new encrypted email account. The recipient she chose was Elara Vance, no relation, a cosmic irony she savored. Eleanor was the 70-year-old grande dame of art criticism, a Pulitzer winner whose integrity was as famous as her prose. She was old school, immune to charm, and had a quiet but well-documented disdain for Julian's brand of populist showmanship. Elara attached the dossier. She typed a single sentence in the body of the email. For your information, ask him about isotope marker EC1138. Then she clicked on the scheduling tool. The email was set to be delivered at 7:45 p.m. the following evening, approximately 30 minutes into Julian's lecture. The next night, Elara sat in her dim, empty apartment, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her impassive face. On the screen, the Northwoods live stream had begun. She saw the familiar auditorium packed to the rafters. She saw her former colleagues in the front rows, their faces rapt with adoration. Then she saw Julian walk onto the stage to a thunderous, sustained ovation. He beamed, soaking it in, a man at the absolute zenith of his power. "Thank you," he began, his voice a warm, confident balm. "Thank you. Tonight, we are not just looking at a painting. We are looking at the triumph of certainty." He launched into his presentation. It was a masterclass. He spoke of Sardo's unique handling of light, the melancholic mood, the very soul of the artist. Then he transitioned to the science. But connoisseurship, as I have always maintained, must walk hand in hand with empirical proof. On the giant screen behind him, he projected magnified images of the painting's layers. Elara watched, a detached observer, as Julian presented her own meticulous forgery as evidence of authenticity. "Look," he said, pointing to a projection of the craquelure. "See how the cracks are alligator-skinned, a natural result of the slow drying of a 16th century oil medium. No forger could replicate this so perfectly. I did, Elara thought, her expression unchanged, with a humidifier and a heat lamp in a concrete box. Our spectroscopic analysis, Julian continued, clicking to the next slide, shows a pigment profile that is perfectly consistent with a Florentine studio, circa 1520. Lead tin yellow, true ultramarine from lapis lazuli, vermilion. He was using the exact techniques she had taught him, explaining the data with a fluency she had given him. He was authenticating her work with her own knowledge. Every word he spoke, every piece of evidence he presented, was another strand in the web she had woven. He was marching toward the cliff's edge, describing the beautiful view. He saved the underdrawing for last, a ghostly image revealed by infrared reflectography. Here, we see the master's hand at its most intimate, the searching, confident lines. This is the artist's mind at work, a fingerprint no one could ever fake. He paused, letting the image hang in the air before the final, triumphant conclusion. The applause began, swelling as he stood back from the podium, his arms slightly spread as if to embrace the adulation. He was vindicated. He was victorious. He was, once again, the unimpeachable Julian Croft. The livestream camera panned across the cheering crowd, and then it stopped. In the front row, Elara Vance, the critic, was not applauding. She was looking down at the phone in her hand, her expression one of intense, sudden concentration. The scheduled email had arrived. The bomb was now live. Elara leaned closer to her screen. She watched as Elara Vance finished reading whatever was on her phone. The old critic's face settled into a mask of cold fury. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. The applause around her began to falter as people noticed the stern, unmoving figure in their midst. Julian, his smile starting to look strained, looked down from the stage. "Yes, Eleanor?" he asked, a hint of irritation in his voice. "A question?" Eleanor's hand rose. The camera zoomed in on her face. The trap was set. The question was coming. The world held its breath. Elara Vance's voice, though unamplified, cut through the cavernous auditorium with the clean, cold precision of a scalpel. It was not a shout, but it silenced everything. "Mr. Croft," she said, her eyes locked on him, her tone one of genuine, piercing inquiry. "I was a great admirer of your monograph on Sardo's use of cobalt pigments. So, perhaps you could enlighten us. Could you please explain why the cobalt blue in this 16th century painting contains a synthetic binding polymer, specifically isotope marker EC1138, which, according to the dossier I've just received, was developed by Dr. Elara Vance and patented by this very museum only 2 years ago?" For a single, eternal second, Julian Croft remained frozen, the triumphant smile still cemented on his face. It was a mask that no longer fit the man. Then, the mask cracked. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a sallow, waxy pallor. His eyes, which had held a room of hundreds captive moments before, darted from Eleanor to the giant, damning projections of the painting behind him, then back again. Those images, his proof of genius, were now his indictment. The slides detailing the pigment composition were no longer a testament to his expertise, but a public confession of his failure to detect a modern polymer. He had not just authenticated a forgery, he had authenticated the poison pill designed to kill him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience, a sound of confusion turning rapidly to suspicion. He looked out at the sea of faces, once adoring, now turning into a gallery of accusing eyes. His authority, the central pillar of his entire existence, was evaporating in real time under the hot glare of the stage lights. I don't understand the question," he finally stammered, the smooth baritone now a thin, reedy thing. "The provenance, the analysis was yours, Mr. Croft," Eleanor retorted, her voice hardening. She held up her phone, the screen glowing. "As is the patent for the chemical you failed to find, a chemical whose existence you personally signed off on. So the world deserves to know, are you incompetent or are you complicit?" The murmur became a roar. The press corps, smelling blood, surged toward the front. Julian stumbled back from the podium, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending horror. He looked like a man who had woken from a beautiful dream to find his house burning down around him. On the live stream, the camera operator, caught in the chaos, zoomed in on Julian's face as utter panic broke through. He turned, not walking but scrambling, and disappeared into the wings of the stage. In her apartment, Elara watched him flee. She watched the pandemonium erupt. She watched Elara Vance, surrounded by a frantic crush of reporters, calmly hold up her phone as if it were a holy relic. Elara didn't wait to see any more. With a quiet click, she closed the laptop. The sudden silence in the room was absolute. The only light was the cold, blue-white glow of the street lamp outside her window. The hum of her machines was gone. The hunt was over. The complex, intricate, beautiful machine of her revenge had run its course, and now it was still. There was no surge of triumph, no cathartic release of rage. There was only this, a vast, profound, and empty silence. Justice was not a thunderclap. It was the echo that came after. The art world imploded. The story was a firestorm, consuming Julian Croft entirely. Investigations were launched not just into the faked Pissarro and the new Sarto, but into his entire career. The original half-dozen Sarto paintings, the very foundation of his reputation, were re-examined with a new, skeptical eye. Flaws, once dismissed as charming quirks, were now seen as evidence of fraud. The name Niccolò Sarto was erased from the canon, becoming a cautionary tale, a synonym for academic hubris and deceit. Julian's life's work was undone. His name not just tarnished, but scrubbed from the record. Elara followed it all from a distance, a ghost watching the ripples spread from a stone she had dropped. She had her justice. She had her father's vengeance. But she had paid a price. In her quest to destroy a monster, she had learned his language, mastered his tools. She had become a forger, a liar, a manipulator who had used a desperate man's debt to her own ends. The pure, devotional love she'd once felt for art, the belief in the sacred truth of the object, was gone. It had been the fuel for her rage, and she had burned it all. The victory felt hollow, a perfectly empty vessel. She had freed herself from Julian's shadow, only to find herself alone in a wasteland of her own making. Weeks later, she stood in the middle of her living room. It was nearly empty now. The boxes were packed. She was moving, though to where, she hadn't decided. All that remained was a single large object, leaning against the wall. It was a blank canvas she had bought on an impulse, primed, white, and silent. It held no stories, no lies, no history. It was a perfect, terrifying void. She picked up a brush. Her hand, which had once held scalpels to restore masterpieces, and had then learned to mix toxic pigments to forge one, felt alien holding it. She dipped the tip into a small pot of titanium white. The paint was clean, uncomplicated. She stood before the canvas for a long time, the brush hovering over the surface. Then, with a single hesitant stroke, she made a mark. A white line on a white field. An act of faith. A beginning. Or perhaps just the quiet acknowledgement of all that was lost. The camera would hold on her face, its expression unreadable, a desolate landscape with the faintest glimmer of a distant, unknown dawn.